Here at the Vancouver Public Library since February 12th, when an opinion article about this evening's event appeared in the Vancouver Sun, we have experienced just how difficult this can be. As we know, there are community members, and particularly those from the Jewish community, who are angry, hurt, and offended that this event is taking place, and they have called for its cancellation. We very much regret that this is the case. However, it remains the library's belief that we must stand by the principle of freedom of expression, and therefore the decision was made not to cancel the program. The selection of materials collected and presented at Vancouver Public Library is based on the belief that every person has the right to access all expressions of knowledge, opinion, and creativity, and express their thoughts publicly within the limits set by law. This freedom of access is essential to the health and development of a democratic society. However, freedom of choice within the library cannot be limited by the personal views of any group or individual, even the majority. Upholding the principle of intellectual freedom can also at times put you in the position of appearing to support points of view in which you do not believe. The role of the public library, however, is to provide a forum for an open and public exchange of contradictory views and to make available materials that represent a wide range of views. This is especially true during Freedom to Read Week, when libraries often present books that people might feel uncomfortable reading. Greg Felton's new book, The Host and the Parasite, is such a book. Greg Felton currently writes for print and online publications about Middle Eastern and Canadian politics. He has a bachelor's degree in Russian studies and a master's degree in political science from the University of British Columbia. With that, I will now introduce Greg Felton.
What I'd like to start off by suggesting is that those of you who have looked at the United States over the last 8 years can only look with sadness and despair at what has happened to what used to be a republic. For 225 years, the United States has been at least nominally supportive of things like individual rights, protection of the person, the rights against the accused, habeas corpus, the right against illegal search and seizure. And now, as we look around, we have the United States becoming the apotheosis, the very opposite of what it started out to be. Torture is now officially justified as national policy. The United States has declared war on its own citizens. People can be arrested without warrant. Wiretaps are allowed without judicial permission. The economy has been spent into an absurd debt of $9 trillion, much of it earned during the time of George W. Bush. And over this time, we are supposed to think of the United States as a republic, as the same country that you and I grew up with. When I was a boy in the 1960s, I used to watch television like all of you, those of you who are older, as much as old as I am. And I'd watch shows like cartoons like Superman, although a Canadian invented it, or Mighty Mouse or Bugs Bunny, and I used to have a great affection for the United States. To me, it was simply a country that espoused the motto of peace, justice, and the American way, truth, justice, and the American way. Well, that no longer applies. And I don't think anybody in this room would argue that the United States is fundamentally different than what it was during the 1950s and 60s or even the 1970s. And because of that, I think I'd like to explain why this change took place. Because if I were to poll the audience, I bet I would find almost all of you, or most of you at least, would say the United States went downhill when George W. Bush occupied the White House. Until Bill Clinton was president, we had a pretty good time. September the 11th knocked down a couple of buildings, led to the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And from there, people might argue, we went into a spiral into the abyss of statism, torture, imperial overreach, and all other sorts of things you can associate with undemocratic activity. Well, if you do that, you end up with a problem. And the problem is this. On October 3rd, 2001, 24 days after September the 11th happened, the Department of Justice handed Congress a document. The Department of Justice handed Congress a document. It was called the USA Patriot Act. And Congress was told to pass it. Now, Congress is a legislative body. It's the body that makes laws. But here we have a Congress being told to follow a diktat from the executive, which is kind of weird. At least Congress should have the right of oversight. Congress should at least evaluate it, discuss it, debate it. Well, Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin, Democratic senator, was one such person who did read it and insisted on some amendments being made before he would introduce it for discussion. The Patriot Act was entered into the House October 23rd and signed by Bush on October 26th. Now, for legislation, that is an absurdly fast scenario. But that document did something very strange and very sad, because it legislated the Republic out of existence. That document killed the Republic and turned the United States into a proto-fascist empire, legally. But if we start from this perspective and think the United States went downhill from this date, we end up with a problem. We have to explain why a Congress would commit political suicide. Why would Congress do this? Well, if you have Congress comprised of Republicans and Democrats who are democratic, it doesn't make any sense. You don't just commit suicide like that. Well, my book takes a perspective that Congress was incapable of defending the Constitution, which of course the Patriot Act utterly destroys. It is my view that the United States went downhill not beginning with George W. Bush, but beginning with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And through a period of 25 years, the United States managed to mutate from a republic slowly toward a police state. And it did so because of events that came out of the Vietnam War. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a bit to the climate of the 1960s and describe for you what happened because of the counterculture and the anti-war movement. In the 1960s, I'm sure many of you know, the United States was fighting two battles at once, Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society public spending programs. Johnson was a populist, he was a reformer. He believed in spending money to help Americans, the poor Americans, all Americans. The problem is it was an expensive proposition, and it ran counter to a lot of people's belief that the state ought to have no role in spending money on people, that people ought to be responsible for themselves. And a lot of conservatives, so-called Straussians or neoconservatives, took exception to this. And as a result of the anti-war movement, the Great Society spending, the rise of civil rights and sexual liberation and equality for women, there developed in the United States a reactionary anti-democratic countercurrent comprised of three distinct elements. One was evangelical Christians, who saw this as a dangerous threat to the stability of the United States and took exception to the spending programs and the liberalized sexual attitudes. The seminal point for this was the 1973 passage of the Roe v. Wade decision, which made abortion legal upon demand, or at least decriminalized it. In that same year, Paul Weyrich founded something called the Heritage Foundation, the very first so-called conservative think tank. And ultimately, 11 members of Heritage would find their way into Ronald Reagan's first government. So to all intents and purposes, Ronald Reagan was a front man for the Heritage Foundation. The second group were the so-called neocons, properly called Straussians, because they followed the teachings of a professor called Leo Strauss. And he got a big leg up from a man named Irving Kristol, a very influential I believe a Jewish professor who left New York, went to Washington, D.C., and helped turn Leo Strauss's philosophy of unenlightened self-interest into a major economic movement. Leo Strauss believed that a government had a right to lie to its own people, to keep truths from them, not to give people, the common people, any sort of help, because that would weaken the fiber of American society. And America had to be strong to face up to the threats of the communists and the fascists and all this sort of stuff. The third group were called Jewish Zionists. Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, Charles Krauthammer, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, a whole list of individuals whom George H.W. Bush would collectively call the crazies. These people together formed what I call the fascist troika, the fascist undercurrent that had been extant in the United States culture for some time, but had not risen to any sort of political prominence, because, for the most part, radical religion, although practiced in the United States, was not really welcome at the highest levels. The separation of church and state was still at least nominally respected. And because of this, it was very difficult to profess open support for evangelical Christianity. And for Jews, it was difficult also, because until the 1967 war, Jewish Americans were very concerned that they might be considered somewhat less than true Americans if they harbored a dual allegiance to Israel. So up until 1967, the Holocaust and other sorts of Zionist issues were kept very much out of the public view. They were very personal. They were not to be discussed. In fact, only 3 books on the subject existed until 1967. And then 1967 happened. Israel provoked a war in the Middle East and managed to seize control of the Suez. It occupied East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Suez, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. It is still an illegal occupation of much of that territory today. But the fact that Israel did it meant that Israel was no longer some afterthought in U.S. policy, which was oil-based. Strictly speaking, U.S. wanted the Middle East for oil. That's all they cared about. But Israel now was a major player. Because American Jews could now look upon Israel with pride because they conquered territory. They could now espouse both support for Israel and the United States, and so did Lyndon Johnson. And principally because Israel was one of the few countries that wouldn't give him grief over Vietnam. So by the time 1973 comes around, we have 3 groups of people: evangelical Christians, Jewish Zionists, and Straussian neoconservatives, neither one of which has any regard for America. What happened then, during this period, which was a reaction against the populism of the 60s, came to a particularly interesting end in 1976 with Jimmy Carter's victory over Gerald Ford, just by a squeaker. It was the narrowest victory since 1912. And that decision, defeating Gerald Ford, was, I believe, a decision by the United States public to turn its back on the Vietnam War, the cruelty, the sadism, the lies, the corruption, the violence perpetrated in the name of a misbegotten war, and turn their minds forward to look for something else. America wanted a new country, and Ford was a remnant of the old country, though a very good man. Carter was an evangelical Christian, a Baptist. He made it possible for Christians to come out from the closet, so to speak, and profess both a political and a religious identity. What Carter failed to understand, though, is that with respect to the Middle East, he was not there to represent the United States. He was there to represent, well, Israel. Because soon after he was elected, now I'm talking about 1977 March in Clinton, Massachusetts, he delivered a speech where he spoke honestly, intelligently, I think, about the need for a Palestinian homeland. Well, the Israel lobby basically had a collective heart attack. They assailed him, they slandered him, they libeled him, they attacked him vigorously. And Carter tried to backpedal out of this, saying, well, it's going to be a condominium with Jordan and all this stuff. But it was too late. The Israel lobby, which came to prominence under Harry Truman in 1948 and owed its allegiance to the Democratic Party, was for the first time considering supporting a Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself came to power with really nothing upstairs except a good moral sense and an aw shucks attitude. He had little understanding of economics, no understanding of foreign policy, and basically made a devil's pact with Jack Kemp and certain what are called neocon supply-side economists that, yes, I'll implement your economic policy if you put me in office, if you support me. And so what happened with the election in 1980 was that the Zionists, both Christian and Jewish, and the neocons, came to power, and their front man was Ronald Reagan. And through the 1980s, we have a transition period. A transition period between the role of oil as the dominant influence and cause of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and that of supporting Israel, to the detriment of oil and to the detriment of the United States. Some of the most interesting things happened soon after Reagan took office. And this happened both in Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine. Menachem Begin was head of Israel at the time, the first Likudnik head of Israel. And Reagan decided that he was going to assert himself as an American foreign policy expert. You know, I want certain things done. In June 1981, Israel bombed the Ozark nuclear power plant in Iraq. It did so illegally, using American weaponry, contrary to the U.S. Procurement Act, using U.S. satellite technology, contrary to U.S. law. And the United States did nothing about it. In September 1982, Reagan spoke of a Palestinian peace. And he, like every other president since Johnson, spoke against continued Israeli construction of illegal settlements. 4 days after Reagan made his speech, Begin humiliated Reagan, that's right, and promised $18.5 billion for new settlements. On September the 6th, 1982, Lebanon was under invasion by Israel. And Reagan saw pictures of bombed out cities and children burnt beyond recognition. And Reagan, for all of his faults, was a very moral man. He had a sense of humanity. And he told Reagan he had enough of this. He wanted to stop doing it. And all that Begin could do was throw up the Holocaust in his face and told Reagan to pound salt. Throughout the 1980s, Israel virtually ignored everything the United States wanted to do in the Middle East. It had carte blanche to do what it wanted. And from the 1980s onward, we see a progressive diminution of oil as the main interest of the U.S. Now I want to say this because from 1932, say, until about 1979, U.S. oil policy was pretty predictable. You put a tyrant in charge. You tell him to repress the democratic rights of his people because, democratic societies provide for their people, and that cost, is factored into the cost of extracting the oil from the ground. America doesn't like paying much for its oil, it likes to get it real cheap. And so in case of Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah, which the U.S. installed over the wishes of the Iranian people, the U.S. had a very nicely contained supply of oil. Repressive regimes, cheap oil, loyal, everything's okay. Well, if you look at that particular oil policy, and we look at how Reagan and George W. Bush behaved, we see an incommensurability. For example, Reagan wanted to ensure a safe political climate for the oil in the Persian Gulf, with Saddam Hussein as head of Iraq. He sent Donald Rumsfeld to Iraq to shake Saddam Hussein's hand and assure him of U.S. support for a pipeline to be built to the port city of Aqaba. Of course, it was well known that Saddam Hussein at the time was using chemical and biological weapons in its war against Iran. It was well known, the Americans knew it. The Americans said nothing. Americans wanted oil, they wanted stability, they wanted a quiet economic climate. Flash forward to 2000-something or other. George W. Bush fabricates an implausible, untenable, farcical case against Saddam Hussein for having weapons of mass destruction in order to bomb the bejesus out of his country. Now, in 1991, Dick Cheney had acknowledged that there was no more threat of nuclear weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein. Colin Powell said the same thing in 2000. So did Condoleezza Rice the next year. In fact, Cheney, twice in 10 years, Powell twice, Rice once, within the last 7 years, had admitted that Saddam Hussein had no useful weapons of mass destruction and posed no threat to the US or Israel. Within months of the last of those announcements, the US policy flip-flopped 180 degrees. All of a sudden, weapons of mass destruction, which were dismissed as nonsense, which were openly acknowledged to be non-existent, were now asserted to be facts. Why would the US do this? What caused the United States to have such a complete change of understanding? Because no new information had come forward to change the previous assessments, which were correct and have been shown to be correct. Well, the only interested party, the only country interested in bombing Iraq was Israel, for two reasons. Well, three reasons, actually. Iraq has a lot of oil. Israel needs oil. Iraq has a lot of water. The Tigris and the Euphrates are within the ambit of what is called the maximalist Zionist claim on Middle Eastern land, from the Nile to the Euphrates. It's also the case that Saddam Hussein was one of the few Arab leaders courageous enough to stand up and defend the Palestinians against the repression and the sadism of the Israeli state. The occupation is to this day illegal, but it's hard to find any outlet in the media willing to say this. So Saddam Hussein was a political problem and also the head of a country that was the capital of the Arab world, culturally speaking. Baghdad was a great center of learning, and Hussein had a good army. But armies in the Middle East are not something Israel wants on its doorstep. Israel wants to have complete military superiority over the region. And so we had a provocation to bomb Iraq. It wasn't just Bush, though. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq was starved under more illegal, no-fly zones and sanctions regimes, which did nothing but starve Iraqi children and other people. Iraq has never posed a threat to anyone, militarily speaking. The Saudis were scared because they didn't like the idea of an secular Arab regime having weapons on its border, but that's their problem. It was not justified to starve a nation just because some countries were uncomfortable with Hussein. I mean, Hussein was an American ally, to all intents and purposes. He attacked Iran after being goaded by the US. The Iran-Iraq war started because the US pushed Hussein to attack Iran around the Shatt al-Arab waterway in the south. And then Saddam Hussein took the American bait and invaded Kuwait. An excuse for H.W. Bush, to put military into Saudi Arabia to secure oil. Now, if you want to ask why on earth the US would attack Iraq, you've got me, because Iraq posed no threat to the United States. It was not in the United States' interest to bomb Iraq. Why else do it? Again, we have to understand that the United States government, especially since Clinton, has been populated by people who owe more of an allegiance to Israel than to the United States itself. To this day, there are people in the American government who are citizens of Israel. And to have a dual citizen forming policy really brings up questions of duplicity, treason, the very sort of concerns that Jews had before 1967. But these don't matter anymore. It is impossible to believe that a republic could commit suicide by passing the Patriot Act. But it makes more sense to believe that Israel, the United States Congress, is not in control of itself. The people making policy would rather serve Israel than serve their own public. I mean, why else would we, with George W. Bush, veto a bill for $30 billion for child insurance, yet write a blank check to bomb Arabs into oblivion? Why terrorize and torture people for no good purpose? I mean, if you want Iraq to supply oil, you don't make the climate so untenable that oil becomes impossible to export. There is direct contradiction between traditional oil policy, as practiced up until the mid-'80s, and oil policy under Bush. And it's important to realize that if we're going to have a discussion about what happened on September the 11th and other such things, we have to look at who benefited from it. The Patriot Act, in my view, represents the culminating act of the fascist coup d'etat that happened in 1980. Now, it was a coup d'etat that happened with the willingness and support of the American public. Because after all, if the liberal Eastern establishment could bring the country to such disgrace in Vietnam, then perhaps it's time we put our faith in people who didn't really think for a living. Put our faith in people who thought of religion, people who told us what we wanted to hear, people who were less intellectual than they were jingoistic and rah-rah, energetic Americans. Ronald Reagan had no business being president, but he spoke to the need of Americans to feel good about themselves. Because both the Republicans and Democrats had been so irredeemably tainted by the war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution tainted the Johnson administration. The secret bombing of Cambodia and the Watergate cover-up destroyed the Republican credibility. And so they put their faith in people who told them what they wanted to hear and essentially consigned the country to people who did not know what they were doing and had objectives other than that serve the interests of the American people. I mean, to this day, the United States has something called the Strategic Oil Reserve Agreement with Israel, under which it will guarantee to supply Israel with oil in the event of a crisis, even to the extent of denying oil to its own people. The United States has been humiliated, abused, disgraced, internationally and domestically, as it moves to support Israel in whatever it does. And it is impossible to think that this is being done willingly, that the United States is the same country that existed in the 1960s and 70s. The only possible thing that we can conclude is that the United States has been under Israeli occupation to all intents and purposes. I think that's hilarious. Well, okay.
Nothing to do with the direction of the American industrial complex?
I'll be finished in a minute. The only way to understand the last 8 years is that it's a culmination of a number of things that happened in the United States that I articulate in my book here, and shows how the United States slowly and quite clearly allowed itself to be occupied and humiliated by a lobby that had at its primary interest the interests of another government. Because a lot of people will argue that, well, the United States is the strongest country in the world. Nobody can push the United States around. Well, if you look at the people who run the United States, the military-industrial complex is a very good example. The interplay between them and the Israel lobby is very, very close. And it makes no sense for the United States to murder Arabs en masse. It makes no sense for the United States to repudiate its own principles and declare war on its own citizens. The only way we can make sense of this is that the people in Washington are serving another government, that we have essentially a treasonous government. And in fact, if you know how both Bush stole the last 2 elections, was not legitimately elected. We have to look at the sort of gangsterism that we most commonly associate with the mafia or some other sort of organized crime. There is no other way to explain the United States from a rational point of view. It cannot be done. There is no rational explanation for the United States' behavior. We must assume an irrational frame of reference. We must assume that the United States we see and the United States that really exists are quite 2 separate things. And if we do that, and we look at the events of September the 11th and how that happened, and the people who were responsible for it, we end up with conclusions that the United States has been dominated by interest groups that put the interests of America behind that of Israel. I have a number of other things I could say, but I don't want to speak for too much longer, and I will give the floor over to questions.
The Six-Day War, you said, was an Israeli provocation.
Yes.
To call it an Israeli provocation would be the same as, well, you know that they closed the Straits of Tiran, the Gulf of Aqaba.
Straits of Tiran is what you're looking for.
Yes, the Gulf of Aqaba to shipping, the Red Sea. The Egyptians closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. 7 or 8 armies were amassing, led by Nasser. The Jordanian army was given over to Egyptian control. They were indicating to the masses who were dancing in the streets in jubilation when Nasser made statements that they were going to kill every Jew, drive them into the sea.
The problem is that that particular history is not true. The closing of the port. Okay, fair enough. I was going to sort of get to the answer.
So to say that Israel provoked that war would be similar to saying that the West provoked the Second World War, because Hitler did not declare war on the West. He marched into Poland, and the West declared war on Germany. So we could say, using the same reasoning, that the West provoked Hitler into a world war.
I'm sorry, that analogy doesn't work. And the reason I can say that is I have the words of the Israeli generals who fought that war. Menachem Begin, in 1982, said in the New York Times, the Egyptian army's concentrations in the Sinai did not prove that Nasser was really ready to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. Moreover, Moshe Dayan stated also that Israel made repeated border provocations against Syria in the north. And at the time, Syria and Egypt had a mutual defense pact, that if one were attacked, the other were attacked. The other would come to his defense. Let me go to, Levi Eshkol, Prime Minister, denied that Nasser had any offensive intent. On October 18, 1967, he told the Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot, the Egyptian layout in the Sinai and the general military buildup there testified to a military defensive operation. Moreover, 100,000 of Nasser's best troops were bogged down in a war in Yemen. He had neither the manpower nor the artillery.
Which he then transported into the Sinai.
No, he did not. No, I'm sorry, sir.
To say that Israel is running the United States is beyond idiocy.
Well, I'm afraid, sir, unlike you, I have some evidence to back up what I say.
What I find you to be, Greg Felton, is an anti-Semite, a Jew baiter, a Jew hater. Many of your comments I find extremely offensive, and I find also your theory that there is a Jewish plot against America to be absolutely ridiculous. You have no validity. You have no validity whatsoever.
Now, I would like to read, if I may, some statements by some people from 1919. I'll just take 1 second. On March 4th, 1919, Congressman Julius Kahn presented Woodrow Wilson with a letter from 3 prominent Jewish Americans. They were Henry Berkowitz of Philadelphia, Max Senior of Cincinnati, and Professor Morris Jastrow of the University of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It read in part, "We raise our voices in warning and protest against the demand of the Zionists for the reorganization of the Jews as a national unit, to whom now or in the future territorial sovereignty in Palestine shall be committed. And this demand not only misrepresents the trend of the history of the Jews, who ceased to be a nation 2,000 years ago, but involves the limitation and possible annulment of the larger claims of Jews for full citizenship and human rights in all lands in which those rights are not yet secure. We ask that Palestine be constituted as a free and independent state, to be governed under a democratic form of government recognizing no distinctions of creed, race, or ethnic descent, and with adequate power to protect the country against oppression of any kind. We do not wish to see Palestine either now or at any time in the future organized as a Jewish state." And that is the voice of American Jewry in 1919. Flash forward now to March 1933.
Objection. Taking too long. He's not answering the question.
Yeah, but I want to
You're in charge, Mr. Whitney, not him.
One second. This comes 2 months after Adolf Hitler seized power in Nazi Germany. The speaker here is Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Our acknowledgement of Jewish nationality provides for a clear and sincere relationship to the German people and its national and racial realities. Precisely because we do not wish to falsify these fundamentals, because we too are against mixed marriage and are for maintaining the purity of the Jewish group. The realization of Zionism could only be hurt by resentment of Jews abroad against the German development. Boycott propaganda, such as currently being carried on in Germany, in many ways is in essence un-Zionist, because Zionism wants not to do battle, but to convince and to build. Our observations presented herewith, and this is from the Zionist Association for Germany, rest on the conviction that in solving the Jewish problem, according to its own lights, the German government, that's Hitler's government, will have the full understanding for a candid and clear Jewish posture that harmonizes with the interests of the state. It is my position that there is a fundamental distinction between a Jew and a Zionist. They are not equivalent. And it is important to state that I have never spoken ill of the people who died under Hitler. I have never spoken ill of Jews. And I should think that people who wish to honor the people who died in Hitler, Germany, should make that distinction. Because it is possible to speak honestly without being anti-Jewish.
There's a lot of people who want to speak here.
The U.S. government has a multitude of lobbyists from every sector in its nation and from every country, including from Arab and pro-Palestinian interests, as well as pro-Israel groups. Because someone disagrees with an American policy on Israel does not mean that the Jewish lobby is any more powerful than the softwood lumber lobby or the Mexican immigrants lobby. Abraham Foxman has written an excellent book called The Deadliest Lies, where he says that as history shows us, when people in the West are sufficiently anxious, fearful, angry, and confused, a familiar scapegoat tends to rise to the surface again and again. It is either the Jews or now the State of Israel. To say that the Jewish people do not have a right to the State of Israel, where their ancestors and their relatives have lived for thousands of years, is to say everyone in this room who is not Musqueam or Coast Salish has no right to live in Vancouver.
About the foundation of Israel, Israel was actually created quite illegally in 1948. The partition plan was never ratified by the Security Council. When Ben-Gurion declared statehood, he did it without moral, legal, or political foundation. And in fact is that the partition plan had 3 more months to run before statehood was declared, and besides which the UN has no authority to take land from one person and give it to another. The partition plan was on its face illegal, never ratified, and as such does not exist in international law. Israel was not created legally. And that is something that can be documentedly searched out by anybody who cares to read and open his mind.
This microphone.
Next.
I think it's really very sad, and I wish everyone would just pause for a moment. If I said something critical of India, no one would accuse me of being anti-Hindu. If I said something critical of France, no one would say I was anti-Catholic. And I criticize my own country and my own religion, which is a very small minority, Zoroastrianism. My religion, I know what it's like to be persecuted because we literally were wiped out as a religion. But this is what really disturbs me. It's why is it I find, and I have so many good Jewish friends, and I've always had so much respect for so many Jewish activists. What really I find very tragic is that there are many people who equate Judaism with Zionism, and if you say anything critical of Israel, you can't even say one thing critical of Israel without them literally getting on defensive. Do these people not ever criticize their own country? Do you never ever criticize your own country? What concerns me is what you talk about Christian Zionism. And these people, if anyone is anti-Jewish, these are the people who think the Jews are going to hell.
You're quite right.
This is, why is it Jews? I'm amazed at how many will embrace them. And I'll just give you an example. And then
May I address that quickly? I would like to address that very good point. Right now, the only people who really have time for Israel are the Christian Zionists, even though they have a very anti-Jewish, and what some people erroneously say is anti-Semitic point of view. The reason is you're quite right. The Christian Zionists want all the Jews to gather in Palestine so Jesus can make a second appearance, rapture all the good Christians up to heaven, let the Jews suffer on the planet Earth. The reason is that Jews overwhelmingly now are turning away from Israel. And even the American Jewish Committee is finding that Jews in North America, American Jews, are finding far less affinity for Israel. Honorable Jews like Mearsheimer, Walt, Finkelstein, Tony Ute, Joel Koval, and other people are finding it necessary to remind people that something is seriously wrong in Israel. And Israel is actually eating itself from within.
Okay. One final comment.
My question is this. Could you possibly elaborate on the massacre of American troops aboard the USS Liberty?
Yes, sir. The USS Liberty was deliberately attacked by Israel in 1967. And it was done so deliberately because the Liberty was a U.S. listing ship, and Israel was planning to execute Egyptian prisoners of war. It could not afford to have the United States Liberty listen in on the communications. They did not want to be caught committing a war crime, because a war criminal wants to do its dirty work in private, in the dark. For more than 90 minutes, the USS Liberty was subjected to a strafing attack. Dozens upon dozens of soldiers, seamen, American sailors were murdered, deliberately murdered. And Lyndon Johnson covered this up because he would not acknowledge that Israel committed a mass murder. And the documentation of this is irrefutable and its extent, and anyone who wants to investigate it may do so. The Liberty was a crime against the United States, and if anyone else had done it, the United States would have gone to war. But Israel gets away with murder literally, because Israel is Israel. And the connection between Zionist money, influence, coercion, and power and media in the United States ensures there will never be proper, honest debate about Israel until forums like this circumvent the national media and expose people to opinions that they might not otherwise have come to hear, and ask them to examine their own prejudices and open their minds and face reality squarely in the face.
I disagree with some of the things you have said and some of the things the opponents have said, but I will defend to the death your right to say them and the right of this library to provide the forum.
Thank you very much.
And possibly even more so, the courage of the Vancouver Public Library, its staff, and its board in letting this event go ahead. As I said, I may not agree with what you say, but it's important that these venues be permitted to be provided to authors such as you.
So you agree that Islam should be the subject next year?
I look forward to hearing a speaker on Islam. And then secondly, I know you'll be talking mostly about the U.S., but could you make some comments on the Canadian government, since it appears to the lay observer that Harper and his foreign policy has made a significant change with respect to the Middle East and to Israel than previous governments. So could you talk to that for a moment, please?
Certainly. Actually, the basic subjugation of Canada to Israeli mouthpiece happened with Paul Martin, and it happened because Erwin Kotler essentially interfered with foreign policy and made Canada become an apologist for Israel at the United Nations. I will tell you one thing about Harper. Before the Palestinians elected their government in Gaza, Harper held a conference call with 3 members of the lobby, and he promised them that he would not recognize Hamas if it were elected. So we have a government, our Prime Minister, openly colluding with agents of a foreign government and predicating Canada's national foreign policy on the interests of a foreign government. I have just been reading recently that the United Canada, Harper, has signed a document that will allow the U.S. to send its troops up here without advance notice for security reasons. Harper is one of the most venal, self-interested traitors this country has ever had the misfortune to be misled by. Harper serves Israel and the United States, which I generally call Israel-America, because to all intents and purposes, there's no distinction. And it's a tragedy to see what has happened under this government. Massive, a Canadian peacekeeper was killed deliberately by Israel, even after being warned off hours before the event. And all this man could do was ask his wife what the hell he was doing in the first place. So I'll tell you what he was doing. He was doing his job. And he was murdered because Israel doesn't want witnesses. And we will not come to the defense of our own people if it would embarrass the Zionist entity in Palestine.
The Arabs say, drive them all into the sea. And the Israelis say that the Palestinians are lice and cancers to be cut out. We have to ignore the fundamentalists and ignore the extremists on both sides and try to form alliances with moderate, informed people to go forward and compromise. Well, I'm sure many people are aware of Theodore Herzl, but also under Carter, there were 20,000 illegals in the settlements, settlers in the settlements, and he was promised no more. There are now about 400,000. Your right has just been ignored. I'm trying to read my writing, which I read so quickly.
While you do that, I can make one comment that during the so-called Truce of Oslo, when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and Bill Clinton formed that great signing ceremony in '93, during the period until 2000, Israel increased the number of illegal colonies by 100% and doubled the amount of people living in those colonies by 100%. Israel has never abided by any international law and never will.
Well, that's the same recent agreement in Maryland. They did that. Now, as to getting the other point of view, the best place to get the other point of view is in Israel itself, in Haaretz.
You're quite right.
Far more actual debate about what's going on, what they agree with Israel, what they disagree with Israel, in Haaretz than we're ever allowed to hear here.
Thank you very much. A very good point. I want to commend you for that, because Haaretz will say things openly that we are not allowed to say here. Like today, Israeli soldiers talked about choking Palestinian boys for sport to see how long they can stay alive and then reviving them, or just pulling their clothes off and just humiliating them.
It's very... Could you wrap up, please? Sorry. And one of my biggest shocks when I was in Israel is to see that they mandated, and I can't remember which is which, but if you're Israeli or Jewish, then you have a yellow license plate or a blue one, I can't remember which. If you're Arab, you have the other color.
That's correct.
I can't understand how somebody suffered through the Holocaust with a star or something that's yellow, doing this to another group of people. And that's just a mentality.
May I address that quickly?
Yeah. I think we'll have to move on.
Yeah, I just want to say that is truly appalling. And yes, I mean the Palestinians are being treated like the Untermenschen that the Jews were. But it's interesting to state that the people who wore the star and the people who were persecuted were not the Zionists, because they were the ones who were helping the Nazis. And the fact is that Israel was only created out of pressure and blackmail by the United States and other countries. It did not have a right to exist. It has never had a right to exist. It is the last vestige of Western colonialism in the Arab world, and it is killing everybody.
Okay, I think we should move on over here.
Yes, Mr. Felt, can you describe, is it not true that the Jewish people under Yitzhak Shamir during the 30s were trained in Mussolini's Italy? And Yitzhak Shamir, when he tried to march with the Germans, these records are all in the Jewish Holocaust Museum at the, how would you call that? The Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem.
Yes, one of the great things that no one ever talks about is how Yitzhak Shamir wanted to form an alliance with Hitler. And he went to Berchtesgaden to try to persuade Hitler to join with the Jewish army against the British. And Hitler thought about it and said, nah, wasn't interested. Because the sad thing is that the last great unprosecuted war criminals from World War II are the likes of Israel Shamir, David Ben-Gurion, and the likes of Yosef Weitz, people who actually, as I stated here, like Rabbi Joachim Prinz, actively supported the Nazi Reich because they wanted to persecute the Jews so badly they would want to leave, but only to Palestine. And David Ben-Gurion actually said in 1935, and I will paraphrase, if I thought I could save all the Jewish children of Germany by allowing them to emigrate, or risk having half of them die by forcing them to go to Palestine, I would regrettably choose the latter. The Zionists actively took part in the extermination of European Jewry. And that is something, whether you like to believe it or not, is actually written, discussed, and if you want to see who did it, a Zionist writer named Edwin Black wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement, and it outlines in painstaking, sad, disgusting detail the collusion of the Zionists with the Nazi Reich. to sabotage the Jewish war veterans of America who started the worldwide boycott to bring down Hitler's Germany. That boycott was so effective, Hitler's Germany, according to the British government, might not have survived about 3 or 4 years because it needed so many imports because its economy had been so skewed by the need to pay reparations to Britain and France for the First World War. And it's sad to see that people who teach history have no knowledge of this. Edwin Black.
Just a comment to Mr. Feldman and then a question for the Chief Librarian. I'm distressed by this painting of Zionists as this bloc that believe in one thing only. I think you can be a Zionist, you can support Israel and its right to self-determination. You can also support the Palestinian people's right to a state.
No.
Well, why don't you just let me finish? It's my opinion. That's your opinion.
Right.
You know, you're welcome to it. There are many people, there are many Israelis who support the peace process, who support two nations. There are many North American Jews that have a wide diversity of opinion and yet would call themselves Zionists. I think it is really wrong to paint this bloc as being this scary Zionist bloc. When Zionists come in many colors, flavors, and stripes, there are as many types of Zionists as there are Jews. There's a great diversity in the Jewish community. There's a great diversity of opinion within Israel. And I think a little more sophistication would probably land a little more credibility to your arguments. Anyway, that was simply a comment, and I don't really need to hear any more.
Well, no, hang on,
wait.
I want to respond to that 1 second. First of all, I appreciate that you're quite right. There are leftist Zionists, there are rightist Zionists, and there are cultural Zionists. However, with respect to the State of Israel, in 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations, and it was admitted under UN General Assembly Resolution 273. Israel is the only UN member to be signed in on a conditional basis. It signed a document by which it promised to recompense every Arab displaced by the invasions of 47-48 and to return to their homes. And they implicitly accepted the terms of UNGA Resolution 194. And since a GA resolution is enforceable, if both parties agree to be bound by it, Israel has every right, as obliged by law, to let every Palestinian go back home. Israel has been in violation of that ever since and is therefore a member not in good standing of the UN. Essentially put, if Israel wants to exist, it has to let the refugees come home and live in their homes and stop importing Jews from all over the world to take their place.
Tell that to the United Nations.
And I was going to ask you if the fact that Mr. Felton's book mentioning that the Jews in America are parasites.
That is not true, sir. No, you may not get away with a libel. I did not say Jews are parasites. I'm talking about the Israel lobby. That sort of defamation is standard procedure, and I will not stand for it.
Okay.
In any event, when we speak about these issues, it is important, and I come back to making the statement again, that in presenting a program such as this, the library is not endorsing the views expressed by individual speakers when.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
It is the point.
Okay.
Well, the cost of this hall is an endorsement. The advertising it is an endorsement. Buying his books is an endorsement.
90% of Canadians don't know that Canada has a free trade.
I think we're just going to have to call it an evening.
Make the last comment.
Okay.
No books on sale.